Dogworks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dogworks. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com. You can support this podcast on patreon.com/firstpawmedia.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by First Paw Coffee Company, specializing in private label premium blend coffee. If you're serious about coffee, you should check it out. First Paw Coffee's passion is high-quality, small-batch roasted coffee. They take the extra time to taste and get everything perfect before they release new blends. They aim to bring you a cup of happiness each time you pour yourself some coffee. Find out more at ak.dog/free and enter for a chance to win some First Paw Coffee prizes, a book from our collection, and tote bag. One winner will be selected at random each month. That's ak.dog/free.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome everybody. This is Robert Forto and you're listening to the continued Iditarod coverage here on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site. And you can find all of our episodes over on dogworksradio.com. And I am joined tonight by my co-host, Toni Reitter, calling in from Kenai Peninsula, Alaska. Toni, how's it going?
Going really well. We've got the sunshine back. It's a little bit warm. The snow seems to be melting, so it's a good day.
It is a good day. It's a good day on the Iditarod Trail. It looks like we may have a winner very soon, and it looks like it is Brent Sass's race to lose. He is in White Mountain currently. He can leave at about, you said 7 o'clock. Is that right?
Correct.
So he can leave at about 7 o'clock tonight. So pretty much right after this show airs. And then it's about 75, 77 miles from the finish. So that may not seem like very far, but when you're only traveling approximately 7-8 miles an hour, that's about a 10-hour run if you don't stop and rest. And I know teams like Brent can easily do that in one run. Back in the old days, a lot of teams would run from White Mountain to safety, and then they would stop for a while and camp there before they made their final push that last 20-some-odd miles from safety to Nome. But that's not necessarily the case, especially with these high-power teams. And then in second place is Dallas Seavey. He can leave at about 10 o'clock tonight. And then the race really is fascinating with the next batch of mushers. And I know we've talked a little bit about, the race for third and, those top 10 mushers with Dan Caduce, Jesse Holmes, Chad Stoddard, Aaron Peck, Richie Deal, Aaron Burmeister, Pete Kaiser, and Travis Beals, at least the last time I refreshed, so I think that's pretty close. And then in the back of the pack, we have the same folks that we've had all along. We have Lisbeth, Kaylin, Apayuk, Yuka, and Eric Kelly are the folks there in the last spots. Lisbeth's currently in that Red Lantern spot, real close with Kaylin. We did have a scratch last night. Joshua McNeil, he was in Galena when he scratched. Do you have a little bit of a story on that?
Yeah, he actually, even though the press release was the common one that we see where the mushers scratch in the best interest of their dogs, he got a message out to, I believe, his wife to put up on Facebook that he had to scratch. He's been having leader trouble, he says, ever since Ophir, having leaders that aren't really confident to keep going and to keep leading like they needed to. And so as he left the checkpoint of Galena, he realized, you know what, they're just not in it, and it's too far to even try to push them. He wants happy, healthy dogs that are having fun, and that's just too long to slog and argue and not get there. So he said he had to put ego aside and do right by his dogs, which he did. And then once that story came out, another one was shared that Eric Kelly, coming into that checkpoint, his sled was pretty banged up and he wasn't sure he'd be able to continue with the sled that he had. And Josh McNeil basically said, well, I can't take this anymore. I'm done. So why don't you take my sled? And so in talking, we talked about that the other night with Ryan and Michelle, Ryan giving hers and how that works when your sled bags are different and everything. Apparently, Josh and Eric have the same style of sled. So everything transferred over easy peasy. And then Eric asked Josh, what he owed him for the sled. And Josh told him, you know what, just get it to Nome. So really great story, really kind of a happy, bittersweet ending to Josh's race, but certainly one of the many stories of sportsmanship that we've heard all along this race.
Yeah, for sure. And I just had Josh on the show earlier this year, late last year, early in the mushing season, if you will. Heck of a nice guy, really, really dedicated to the sport and, his family and the whole 9 yards. And I know he used to live down in your neck of the woods for a while and then moved up north when he took a job on the slope. I believe he's called Crooked Creek Kennels or something like that. Is that right?
Yep. His kennel was outside of Casilla, I believe near Crooked Creek. So I'm sure that's where that kennel name comes from. Really nice guy. I know that I have talked with him in person when he ran the Tuscaloosa 200, but it wasn't any big, long conversation. It was just basically hi and thank you and that sort of thing. But he's a really nice guy. I really enjoy chatting with him online. And he's one of the positive voices in the sport. So I'm always cheering for him to do well.
Yes. And we talked about those top 3 to 10 mushers there, separating Brent Sass and Dallas Seavey, that group of 7 or so mushers that are really jockeying for that third place. And we really have a race there. And there's quite a few stories there. I think, at least in terms of right now, one of the biggest stories is the race between Jesse and Dan. According to my page, they're only about a minute or so apart when they pulled into Koyuk. What is going on with those two guys?
Well, Jesse Holmes has been vying for third for quite a bit of the race. I think right before they all hit the Yukon, he was really starting to push, and people were wondering if he was going to overtake Dallas. And Jesse at one point was interviewed, and he said, well, yeah, I'm going really fast, but at some point I'm going to have to slow down. And it seemed that happened in the last couple of legs getting to the coast. What helped Jesse was last night, the wind picked up there between Shaktoolik and Koyuk. And so most of the teams, basically the teams third and back, all kind of hunkered down there in Shaktoolik, waited until daylight to cross the sea ice. So it helped a lot of teams that were seeming to either struggle or at least fall back from the placement they held earlier in the race. They all kind of caught up, and then a lot of leapfrogging happened. You saw Chad Stoddard. He was first out of Shaktoolik today, which was really cool to see. He's actually running Dallas's B team, not his puppy team, I was informed this morning. He has 7 of Dallas's main kennel dogs, as well as 7 puppies who've never run the race before. So he's got the B+ team, is what Dallas's aunt was calling it today. But Aaron Peck also made a move that I don't think would have happened had it not been for that little hunker down last night. But Jesse and Dan Caduce, who is always a sleeper musher in these races, in my opinion, he just quietly runs his race, and if he can make a move, he will, but he's not really looking for placement so much as just to get his dogs to Nome. And right now, Dan Caduce has all 14 dogs. He is the only team that still has the same number of dogs that they started with. He's just a few checkpoints from finishing. I think his goal is just to get all of those dogs to Nome at this point, and yet he is running right there with Jesse, who has 9 dogs in harness right now.
And a quick story about Aaron Burmeister. We talked about him earlier in our coverage about how he sort of conceded way back and said, I don't have a chance of winning this race, but I want to do a very good finish. And I know there was a story in the Anchorage Daily News, a story very similar to what we heard from Dallas right before the race, and that is he wants to pull back from Iditarod a bit and spend some time with his kids. That seems like sort of a running story this year. Is that right?
It is, yeah. Aaron has kids right there in the same age range as Dallas's daughter, Annie. So right there in the teenage, preteen age range. And their interests are starting to really develop. And it sounds like Aaron wants to be kind of, the sports dad or the theater dad. I don't know what his kids' interests are necessarily. But it sounds like to me that he feels like he doesn't want to miss anything more about their growing up. In a few years, they're going to be off and doing their own thing. So he's really wanting to take the time and enjoy his family, which I totally commend him for. He's been quite emotional on Insider the last few interviews I've seen because he's coming into basically his home turf. He grew up in Nome and the surrounding area, and so the west coast of Alaska, that's something that he knows a lot of. He's got family and friends all over, and so he's kind of taking it easy. He said that he's not willing to push anyone to get there in a hurry, and he's not willing to be pushed by anyone. He's just going to, again, run his race, and where he ends up, he ends up. But I think as I see him kind of sitting further and further back, it almost feels like he doesn't want this to end quite yet. If he goes the rate that he could, because he was going for third for quite a while here, I think he knows that the sooner this is over, the sooner he has to let it go for a little bit. And he's already done that once. He did that in the early 2000s. He downsized his kennel. I think Dallas Stevie ended up with quite a few of his dogs. And then he decided to come back. So he's already done that once, and we've seen a lot of mushers do that. But I think this is the last time we see Aaron Burmeister for a while. I keep saying for a while. I'm hoping this is not a full-on retirement like he said that it was going to be late last year. So.
Well, Toni, earlier in the race, we talked about another retiree in a different sport. And he, at the time that we started our coverage, he was ready to hang it up as well. But boy, that changed very quickly in the sports world. And it looks like your favorite athlete, Tom Brady, is coming back. I understand that. And interesting enough, you really pulled a name out of the hat today on Twitter. Or maybe as Facebook, you said, do we want to talk about Tom or Mark Sanchez? And for those that don't know, Mark Sanchez would be definitely the underdog of the two. But I think it's an interesting story because we hear a lot of this right now with Iditarod about sort of this changing of the guard, if you will, with these kind of old timers, and then of course these middle timers, if you will, when you think about Dallas and Aaron and Ramey and right. That age group of mushers, and then we have this core group of up and comers when we think about folks like a lot of the rookies this year. We just mentioned Josh McNeil and Richie Deal and those types of names. A lot of people don't know who they are, but they have a lot of firepower in their kennel and in their mushing history, don't they?
They do, yeah. And I have to chuckle that you put Dallas in with people like Aaron Burmeister, and then you name all of the newer, not so well-known names, and he's actually the same age as the other guys, not the Aaron Burmeister.
Right, yep, now that I think about it.
It feels like Dallas has been here forever, and that, especially when it comes to mushing, he's more of an old soul because he has. I mean, this was basically his final exam, he said, in high school, was to run the Iditarod. Everything about his childhood, even the way that he was taught, in homeschool, it kind of centered around raising and running the dog. So it does, it does feel kind of like a changing of the guard. I said it on Facebook, I think yesterday, that I would accept Tom Brady backtracking on his retirement if that means that Aaron and Dallas also would backtrack from their little "we're stepping back" promise there, because it almost feels like the end of an era. I've been watching Aaron Burmeister for at least 2 decades. Dallas, of course, has been dominant for over a decade. It's been 10 years since he won his first one. So it does feel a little like, no, don't go. Jeff King's also talking about not doing this anymore. That's my childhood right there, is when Martin Boozer and Jeff King retired. That's my childhood. So I'm one of those fans that's like holding on as they're 1 foot out the door. Don't go.
Right.
But at the same time, it's such an exciting time in our sport, because here we are. I mean, we're looking at, the Chase Pack, and any one of these names could actually win an Iditarod in any given year. And that was not something that we could say when I was growing up in Iditarod. It was, maybe in a really good year, you had 5 really strong teams in Iditarod. And now we have at least 15 to 20 names that on any given Sunday could be the Iditarod champion.
Any given Sunday, another football reference for sure.
I know.
So moving on here, we've talked about this a little bit throughout our coverage, and it seems to me, and I know your finger's more on the pulse of this than I am, that this has been a pretty light story year in terms of media coverage, and something that just really popped. Whether it's a famous rescue or something like that. Obviously, the media picks up on the sensational stories, but it seems to be a quiet Iditarod. What do you think?
It has. There haven't been a whole lot of scratches, and now that I've said that, I'm going to jinx it, and by tomorrow there will be 10 new names on the scratch list. But we're going to crown a champion tomorrow morning, and we have 5 scratches for the entire race. That's a really low number. We did have the sensational story of the 2 Martins and Matthew Failer dealing with a very angry moose. But yeah, we don't have anything like the Elam 11 from 2020 or the crazy storm that knocked out Allie and Jeff and kept, everyone stuck and hunkered down wherever they were, like in 2014. You don't have airlifting people out of the sea, or not the sea, but the overflow right there on the sea ice, like they did with Matt Failer in 2020. So it does, as far as sensationalist stories, we haven't seen a lot, and Insider really doesn't follow the middle or the back of the pack, which is where some of those more interesting stories happen. Where you have, I think, Deke, the other day when he was going into Galena, he missed the turn, and so he said he toured the entire town of Galena. He's like, I saw the hospital and the schools and and he finally had to be guided by just one of the villagers there to go where he needed to go. You hear about Jesse Holmes getting drugged into Unity literally because he tipped his sled over somehow, and he decided it was just better to drag into the checkpoint than it was to try and stop the team so he could right the sled. Those stories, they don't often get told by the main outlets like Anchorage Daily News or Alaska's News Source, which is the local TV station here in Anchorage. And certainly Insider, they're too busy worried about the front of the pack to really tell those stories, which I wish they would. But thank God for something like Alaska Public Media, because they're the ones that are really staying with those stories and sharing them more than some of the other major outlets.
Well, I know for a fact nobody has mentioned murder ponies and ugly dogs in the same episode like we did last night. So I think if they did a keyword search, I think we would rank pretty high up there on Google last night.
Probably.
Okay, so let's move on. We have a lot to cover. Tonight, our top story, or our story of the day, is about what mushers and dogs eat on the trail. And I think more importantly, the more interesting facet of this is what mushers eat on the trail. Every musher takes their own special things, whether it be chocolate or gummy bears or chocolate-covered peanuts or beef jerky or something is a fan favorite. There's a heck of a lot of salmon, a heck of a lot of pasta, a heck of a lot of pizza, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to let you go first. What are some stories you have heard over the years about unique musher cuisine? Maybe not just on Iditarod, but in other races as well.
Sure. So I cannot remember for the life of me. I think it might have been Deke. This year told Insider what they were eating. Maybe it was Deke. I can't remember now. But a couple of mushers then chimed in when I started getting grossed out. But he brings baby food, those little Go packet baby food full of the veggies and the fruits. And he said that was an easy way to get, something a little more nutritious in him. And of course I'm like, oh, pureed food is the most disgusting thing ever. And then I had mushers chiming in going, it's a smart idea. It's so much easier. It's easier to thaw out because you can just put it in like a breast pocket in your parka, let it warm up from your body heat a little bit, and then just suck it down and, throw away the little tube and you're good to go. I can remember one year, I vividly remember a picture from, I think, Facebook. It was Martin Boozer's drop bag. And I feel like I'm dating myself now because he had from the Cars Deli, not Safeway, Cars Deli, he had their Mongolian beef. And he had enough Mongolian beef packaged and ready to go to feed, I swear, the entire town of Kena, because it was just covering like every inch in this picture, which I loved. Cars Mongolian beef. Safeways is disgusting, but Cars had some really good Mongolian beef. And I remember just thinking, what a brilliant idea. That is not something I would remember to do. In helping over the years with food prep for mushers, a lot of breakfast burritos with stuff that I would never eat in them to get their protein and their energy in. And like you said, a lot of pasta, so lasagnas and that sort of thing. But yeah, no, that's the one that I learned about this year with the baby food. Just for me, I'm a texture eater, and that just sounded the most disgusting thing I've ever heard. So kudos to all of you mushers that do that.
Right. And you mentioned, Toni, about ease of use. And for folks that may not know, in order to melt the dog's food, which obviously is frozen, you have to heat up water in a cooker. And it's pretty much like boiling a pot of water on your stove, but you want to do it as quick as possible and as efficient as possible. And often you're using that same water that is boiling to heat up your human food as you're going. So often the meals are in freezer type packs, and then they dunk them in that water to thaw out. And it's very common to do things like pizza. And I know that probably sounds gross, but when you're out on the trail 8 or 9 days in and you're craving a piece of pizza, I don't care if it's soggy or not, it's going to taste delicious. Also, right. You want things that are very high calorie, high protein, high fat. So that's where a lot of the candies and the nuts and the chocolate and that sort of thing come in, because you want it not only to be palatable, because if you're going to race 8 or 9 days, you don't want to eat anything. You're just exhausted. You want to finish. You're not worried about how well things look at that point. You just want to make sure it goes down and does its job as food should. But then you have folks like Martin Booser. I saw his drop bags this year, and he and a lot of other folks have fans of theirs or supporters of theirs. Their job is to make the drop bag foods for the mushers, and they come up with some marvelous looking meals. And like I said, everybody has their favorites on what they like to take on the trail. When I run dogs, I'm a pretty light eater. Sort of my go-tos are Capri Suns, like you said, put them in a breast pocket and they melt from your body heat because everything freezes. I like to eat beef jerky. I like to eat gummy bears. And one of my go-tos is what I call moose nuggets, and they are not what you think, but they are this sort of like an energy bar. Think of like a Cliff Bar with nuts and sort of a molasses base, and they don't freeze, so you can pop them in your mouth and get those calories that you need. Back on the dogs, they eat an enormous amount of calories every day, and often the mushers have some type of mixture of kibble, beef, chicken, fish, sometimes chicken skin, sometimes pieces of fish that they use for snacks, as well as beef about the size of Snicker bars. And those dogs are getting anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 calories a day. And if you think about that, that's like, I think 6 or 7 Big Macs a day. If you think about people food, that's a heck of a lot of calories for dogs. But remember, they're pretty much running in that 24-hour cycle on and off for several hours a day. So if you're running a marathon, what would you eat if you were a dog or a human? And I think it's a really cool story to talk about, and it always seems to be a fan favorite question to ask, doesn't it?
It is, yeah. And talking about the ugly dogs yesterday, they also have renamed that lovely little bit of kibble and meat and fat soup that they give the dogs. They call it Meaterade. And so now I'm kind of wishing that, when a musher crosses that, for the finish and they're winning, that somebody dumps just a big old Meaterade over them, just like in football or basketball when the championship is won and they throw the Gatorade over the coach. It should happen in mushing too.
Yeah, it should. And just to give people a visual perspective of what this food looks like, it looks like a really hearty beef stew. It's got big chunks of meat in it, and often it will have that fatty substance that you often will see in a very hearty beef stew. And the dogs don't care. They will eat every bit of it in just a matter of seconds, and they're ready to do the next task, whether it's rest or run or whatever. That's how the mushers and the dogs eat. Let's move to our musher profiles of the evening. We planned on talking about Yucca Honda when we spoke last night. And I tell you what, I searched all over the place. I couldn't find much. I know you couldn't find much as well. Let's start off with Yucca, and then we have a surprise for you guys on our profiles to end the show. So what do you know about Yucca?
So Yucca has been around for quite a while. If you're a fan of mushing and follow more than Iditarod, seeing her name pop up on Iditarod this last year, it was really kind of exciting for me because I did remember when she ran her rookie run a few years back. But she's run the quest several times. Most recently, I believe, was this year. She ran one of the shorter versions that they did this year. But she's been running dogs for about 24 years now. She was originally born and raised in Japan, where my understanding in my very brief research is dog mushing is not a feminine sport over there. It's normally for men. Now, this is back, a few years when she started mushing. I'm sure things have changed, but when she started mushing, she actually started it against her parents' wishes, which in her culture was very taboo at the time. She moved to Canada. She was running dogs for a tour company there. And then she started her own kennel. She's now in Alaska, is my understanding. She says she has about 24 dogs in her kennel. And I'm taking this from her Yukon Quest musher profile. Her kennel bloodlines come from, she says, her own from the Zirkel bloodlines, Burmeister, and Jesse Holmes bloodlines there. She also has, and this was just kind of surprising in my little bit of research I was able to do, she was kind of the subject matter of a 10-minute short documentary called Underdog, which followed her as she got ready to do one of the quests. I can't remember what year that was. She's also, speaking of the Yukon Quest, she's one of the mushers that the year that they had to fly, they had to send in the U.S. National Guard, I think, to fly them off of one of the mountains because of the ground storm that happened there, and it was becoming dangerous for all involved. So they had to do an evac rescue for her and several other teams, is my understanding. So she's had some exciting adventures on the trail. She's not as well known, but she always has a smile on her face. When she came through my section of Anchorage, she was one of the final mushers, and she took the corner in our area too quickly, which many mushers do, and she crashed. And I swear she never stopped smiling. She was laughing so hard at the fact that she fell, when most mushers are just so grumpy and I can't believe I did that. And oh my gosh. And she was just like, no, this is the best day of my life. And it was a little weird, but it was also, her smile was so infectious. So I was kind of excited when you chose her, but at the same time I was like, we're not going to find much about her. I've tried.
Well, I think you have a heck of a lot more than I have. I'm sitting here looking at her career summary on Iditarod. It's one start in 2015. She came in 55th place as a rookie in 12 days, 8 hours, 32 minutes, and 55 seconds. So that's more of an old school pace. That's typically that back of the pack Red Lantern type pace. But she's right there right now with that group, but she's a little bit faster than the Red Lantern, at least as we sit right now. Is that right?
That's correct.
So, Toni, we have a special surprise for our listeners, and this is for the folks that make it all the way through to 32 minutes and 5 seconds. We have a different type of profile tonight, and I'm sort of tagging this as when we talked about the Faces of Iditarod a few nights ago, and we covered how that whole process works. And it's not just the mushers, it's not just the dogs, it's not just the checkers or the vets, it's everybody that's involved with the race in one form or another. And I know, Toni, we talked about you and how you are now a face of Iditarod and part of that project. But we have an interesting story that you have with your grandparents and in your grandfather in particular. I know on the first night we talked about how you're a multi-generational volunteer. You guys have been doing this for years. You talk about your grandfather and your dad all the time on social media about all of their swag that they have, whether it be Ferrandi buttons or hats or whatever. And I think this is going to be kind of cool. What can you tell us about those early days of your family and how they helped out on Iditarod?
Sure. Well, I give a lot of credit to my grandfather because he's kind of like me. Once we get involved with something, we go in all the way. But who got us started in Iditarod was really my grandmother. She worked as a clerk for one of the judges in Anchorage, and back then he was one of the traveling judges that also went out to the different rural areas of Alaska to do court cases and what have you. And he ended up having to fly out to McGrath right around the time of Iditarod coming through in late March, because that was back in the mid to late 70s. And they just happened, the teams were coming in as they were there. And so the judge looked at my grandmother and he said, hey, do you want to go watch these dogs come through? And she's like, they're dogs. What are you talking about? Because she was still kind of new to Alaska. And so they go out there, and my understanding, now this could be family lore, but my understanding was they were a little low on volunteers. And back in the day, you didn't really have much vetting to do. It was just, oh, you're an able-bodied person. Here's a clipboard. Start checking people in. So that's kind of how my family got started with it, was she just kind of got nosy and then got voluntold to help out. So she comes back to Anchorage. She's telling my grandfather all about this. And he's like, well, we need to get involved with this. And then they find out that my grandfather's cousin was already involved. She was helping, with, I think she was helping with office duties or something. So she gets them involved by being trail guards for the Anchorage start, which back then was not a ceremonial start. It was actually part of the race. So they did not only crowd control, but at that time they also had to do traffic control for the vehicles. And so as the race changed, all of the ways the start happened, and of course it moved downtown and then had to come through Anchorage, they really got stuck in this one spot. And it used to be called the Tudor Crossing. Now it's the Alaska Native Medical Center. So it's really fun to kind of find some of my grandfather's old notes from back when they were still doing that traffic control, where they had to stop the cars when a team was coming through, and they'd push some snow onto the road so that the dogs could come through. Then they'd push the snow out of the way so the cars could go through, and then back and forth doing that. It wasn't as busy a road, Tudor, it was back then as it is now. But I've got different maps where the things have changed on Tudor so much. And there used to be, I guess, driveways that they had to deal with, and now there's no driveways. So that's kind of how it started. My grandfather and my grandmother had a huge team of people that, in talking with, I still have two of the original members of that group, Jim and Karen Gallagher. And they helped, they counted it down, and it was their, I think they said 33rd or 34th Iditarod that they've physically helped with in our team. And they were sitting there and saying, we're the last ones. We just got to thinking because everyone else has passed on. And so there's a legacy there with them. They're closer to my parents' age, so I've got them around for a little bit longer, though they did tell me they were retiring from helping, and I think I can cry enough to keep them around. But just the stories, the craziness of it all. My grandparents used to have their motorhome parked there with a sign that said Tudor Crossing Iditarod headquarters on it. And then after all the teams would go through, we'd go into the motorhome and we'd eat beans, and we'd all tell our stories about what happened with the crowd and with the different dog teams. And invariably, every time we'd get a knock on the door about a half an hour to an hour after all of the teams had gone through, we'd get a knock on the door and open it up, and someone would say, "When did the dogs start coming through here?" So just kind of that fun little bit that, we don't really have that anymore, because with my grandparents being gone, we don't have the motorhome anymore. Plus there's no place to park it anymore. But yeah, as Anchorage grows, a lot of those memories are just now memories. There's not really anything to say, oh, Bob Reitter stood right here. Because where he used to stand is now a pet memorial for the dog park that's right next door to it. So it's bittersweet anymore when I go and volunteer, because all of those people are no longer with us. But my grandparents, I still have their jackets with all of their Iditarod volunteer patches on it. My grandpa's volunteer hat that he has, and it's nice to carry on the family tradition.
So before I ask my question, of course, this is a race that is run by volunteers. This could not happen if all of those volunteers in every part, whether it be those early days at the ceremonial, all the way up until, the cleanup after everything is done in Nome, it could not happen without a cadre of volunteers along the way. Many of them are very, very dedicated, and as you mentioned, fly from all over the world. At least in the past, they did, to be a part of this, and many of them come back year after year. So I have to ask this one question. So your grandfather was involved. Obviously, your parents were involved. How did they convince you to do this as well? Was this just something that was sort of ingrained in your family, and you got drug along every march downtown, or did you just find a real passion with it when you were young?
Well, I was born the same year that the first woman won the Iditarod, and so I think my grandfather used that to his advantage, because I was growing up really young in watching Libby Riddles run and Dee Dee Johnrow run, and of course Susan Butcher run. So I had a book. I tell people that this book changed my life from a very young age. I had Danger the Dog Yard Cat. And it was the book that came with the audio cassette that played music and read you the story. And so it was Hobo Jim singing the songs, Libby Riddles reading you the story, and it's about a dog yard cat running to Nome because the lead dog got hurt.
Ah.
Amazing book. If you haven't read it, you need to, because it's just the best book ever. I still have it. I still have the audio cassette, and I am not ashamed to admit that I listen to it every year. But I think Grandpa, just from a very young, my earliest memories are of the Rondi races and for Rendezvous and Iditarod. But then my parents moved me down to the Kenai Peninsula, so we didn't always make it up for Iditarod. I think I had been to 2 restarts in my entire childhood. But I moved back up to Anchorage to go to college, and I applied to be one of the helpers of the photographer doing the Iditarod photography, which Jeff Schultz does quite a bit of, but he also has other photographers come and help. And even though he didn't hire me, another one of the photographers did. And so he wanted me to take pictures, and he just happened to pick the same spot that my grandparents volunteer at. So that's kind of how it started. Once I got into adulthood, was Grandpa was like, okay, you've done this once, so now you can come help us do this. And that's how it started. And then when my grandmother got sick, my grandfather, he was like, I've got to take care of her. We can't do Iditarod anymore. And I was not about to let that spot go to somebody new. I wanted it to stay in the family kind of thing. And so I asked my grandfather if it was okay if I took on the duties of organizing and coordinating, and then he and Grandma could just come and hang out. And he said, well, if Iditarod gives you permission, you can go ahead and do that. So that's how that started. And just about the same time that happened, the coordinator that basically my quote-unquote boss during all of that, he also was getting ready to retire, and he allowed his son to take over. So Derek Petty and I kind of started at the same time, and we're kind of very attached to each other when it comes to Iditarod. It's like, you can't leave, and he says I can't leave, because if either one of us is not there, we wouldn't know what to do. And so I roped in one of my childhood best friends to come help every year, because he was like me. We grew up with my grandpa pushing the Iditarod on us and stuff. And so, the next generation just kind of happened naturally.
Very cool story. And if you get a chance, Toni, find that book, take a copy of it, tag our show in it tonight, and put it on social media, whether it be Facebook or Twitter, because I think a lot of our fans would like to dig around eBay and possibly find that book as well. And one thing that Toni is also going to try to do before we post our show today, she's going to try to find a picture of her grandfather, and that's going to be our cover art for tonight. So I'm putting her on the spot, because I typically edit this and get it up within about a half an hour. So if we have a different picture, we're going to blame it on Toni tomorrow. Very good.
Sounds good.
Very good. Anything else we missed before we go?
I'm sure we've missed stuff, but I think we covered everything you wanted to.
So our musher of the day tomorrow, I guess it's my turn to pick. And since we did 2 females and a male today with Grandma, Grandpa, and Yuka, I'm going to pick a guy, and it's going to be Matt Paviglio. He is a fellow Chugiak dog musher board member, super volunteer type guy. Heck of a good story there. I don't know if you know much about Matt, but if you don't, definitely do a little bit of research and see what you can come up with.
Sounds good.
All right, guys, we are nearing the end of our winner to come into the race. We may have a winner. I assume we will have a winner before our show tomorrow, and that will beat all of our expectations. We said early Wednesday morning, late Tuesday night. I think that's going to be a little bit different. So we'll see if it's Brent Sass or Dallas Seavey, or somebody pulls a major upset and is the Cincinnati Bengals of this year. So we'll see what happens and see what's going to happen tomorrow. We will probably tell you who a champion is. I'm sure you already know since you listen to our show. But anyway, that is our show for tonight. On behalf of my co-host, this is Dogworks Radio. We will see you guys tomorrow. Goodbye.
From Dogworks Radio, this is Mushing Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Alex Stein and Robert Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto, created for Dogworks Radio.
So earlier, you learned about First Paw Coffee Company. Now I'm going to tell you about its Trailbreaker Blend. First Paw Coffee Company's Trailbreaker Blend is inspired by our love of the Northern Lights, frosty paws, and sled dog trails. How cool is that? The Trailbreaker Blend is a private label premium blend that was developed just for them. It's a medium dark roast from Central and South America, highlighting flavors of brown sugar, hazelnut, and plum. Be sure to go to ak.dog/free and enter to win a bunch of cool prizes. That's ak.dog/free.